again, in the tradition, you find these texts where yogis have gone to these places to try and to find various parts of the landscape that correlate to the chakras, particular chakras of the body of this goddess, to do particular practices there to work on that, opening that chakra or bringing the energy into the central channel. There's all sorts of different subtle body practices. It's an incredibly complex subject. But those places they have a kind of juice. They're juicy places to do that kind of practice. And they're not easy places to get to often. So you'll find these texts where you have these Tibetan yogis and they're going to try and find the secret chakra of Vajravarahi. And, you know, they get bitten by flies and they're attacked by wild boars. And there's just, it's like a really difficult journey to find these places and do practice. And they're purifying their karma, because in this tradition, you can liberate within one lifetime. But there's a lot of stuff you got to get through to do something like that. And so I love the idea that these places connect you with that expressive energy of the deity. That's the piece that I find really advanced. It's a very evolved human idea, actually.
I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today our guest is Dr. Amelia Hall. Amelia is an assistant professor of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism and associate dean overseeing the Department of Wisdom Traditions at Naropa University. She obtained her doctorate from Oxford in 2012. Her dissertation, Revelations of a Modern Mystic, the life and legacy of Kunzung Dechen Lingpa, translates and reflects upon the biography of a Tibetan Buddhist mystic visionary and his revelatory teachings. Her research interests include the Tibetan Terma, treasure tradition, Himalayan sacred landscape, and interspecies relationships, particularly between human and non-human beings. Her most recent work is a co-created, community-based, participatory project to document and preserve the traditional ecological knowledge, oral narratives, rituals, and sacred texts of the Tibetan Buddhist Memba community in the eastern Himalayas. So delighted to have you here, and your research and interest on relational landscape and spiritual pilgrimage feels very timely on many levels. So thank you for being here, Amelia.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
And I would love to start with hidden lands, the origin and the purpose on both the inner and outer level.
So hidden lands in the Himalayan sense, they're called Bayal. That's the word in Tibetan. Sometimes they're called Bene, but literally means secret place or secret abode, or they're often called hidden lands. There's a lot of scholarship on this. And when you talk about outer and inner, there's a lot of different ways that I could relate to you asking that question, because part of what I think of as the outer understanding of hidden lands is tied up with what you might call Western scholarship or academic scholarship. And the origins of hidden lands, when you're looking at it from that perspective, seems to these types of places, when you look at Tibetan texts, seem to come out of a certain period of history in Tibet around the 13th or 14th century. And before that, there's some scholarship that sort of say there were kind of places for kings, kingly refuges. But there's certainly a sort of explosion of these texts and this idea coming out in a certain period of time. And they show up as places to escape to during periods of pandemics, invasion, really difficult circumstances, all sorts of different sort of bad things happening. And this is just my own theory, but I think it's really interesting that those sorts of things those kinds of texts and that idea starts to happen at the same time that you have the plague that is ravaging the world and comes out of Central Asia. And people always think about the bubonic plague and they think about Europe, but it devastated millions and millions of people in Asia as well. I don't think it's a coincidence that these types of ideas about escaping to a place I'm fairly certain there's a connection, because they talk about plagues and you have the Mongol Empire and you have a lot of really intense stuff happening in that time period. And that's relates to an outer understanding of hidden lands in the sense of them being places of refuge to escape and be safe from famine, from plagues, from war, from all of those places. And so I always have this joke, they're like prepper texts, it's sort of like really old school prepper texts. But they also seem to be bound up with kind of territorial expansion, places of economic resources. That's a whole sort of very outer understanding of them. And then you get to what I'm kind of interested in my work as a scholar, which is, yes, there's all of these outer understandings and very pragmatic understandings of them, but there's also this inner journey, and there's this inner and secret understanding of these places where they're sites for realization. There's qualities within these places that can wake you up very quickly. And I'm really interested in this idea of a sort of tantric paradise or sacred landscapes, which, by the way, are not maybe what a lot of people might think of as a paradise, because we have this idea of a paradise being, everything's wonderful and nothing bad happens. But in the tantric idea, there can be like massive stinging nettles and huge leeches, and that's all good because it's all kind of food for your practice and it helps to wake you up. But you have these ideas of these qualities actually embodied and embedded and sort of resonant in the landscape itself, and that gets enhanced by practice. And so you have generations of yogis going to these places, and a lot of the time they're located in these border regions of Tibet, and in these places where there's a lot of people think of Tibet as sort of snowy mountains, but there's areas of Tibet, particularly in the south, that are forests, and there are meadows, and there's lots of things grow, and like the lower elevations that you get, there's a lot of fruit trees, there's plants, there's a lot of abundance and animals. And so these are places where you can survive well. And they also become connected with the figure of Padmasambhava, who's this second Buddha, and he's this Mahasiddha. He's this tantric wizard that comes from India and brings Buddhism to Tibet in Tibetan historiography and mythology. And he's a treasure revealer, and he is connected with these places because he dispatched his disciples, and one of his main disciples was his consort Yeshi Sogyo, and she went and dispatched treasures into the landscape of Tibet, physical objects, but also teachings for later practitioners who were sometimes are connected with his original disciples to come and reveal, to help beings during these times. And there's all sorts of ways in which you have texts that are about these hidden places where Yeshi Sogyo, who's one of his main students, and his partner she's asking him about these places, and he tells her where they are, and then they're recorded in these texts. And some of these texts themselves are revealed later on by somebody else who's connected with them. So there's all sorts of like time traveling, intersecting kind of magic stuff going on when you think about these on an inner level as well as on an outer level.
And how are these sacralized landscapes chosen? Is there are there certain patterns when Padmasambhava chose these particular spots, what he was looking for in a landscape?
So when you read these texts, there are certain characteristics. And there's this Tibetan word sache, which is a kind of arrangement, a kind of good arrangement of a land. Like it's a nice landscape. Like you use sache if you were Tibetan, in Tibetan, you might say, the sache is very good. Like the whole kind of arrangement of the land, the kind of geomantic understanding of the right arrangements of things. And particularly for these hidden lands, there's certain characteristics. So there's a description where this place will actually be surrounded. There will be a valley surrounded by mountains, and the mountains, you'll actually feel like you're sitting in the middle of a lotus. So one of the very sort of formulaic things that you see in the descriptions is that the surrounding mountains look like the 8 petals of a lotus, and you're in the middle of it. But that's very important for practice, what's called sadhana practice, because it's a visualization that you're meant, it sort of aids in your visualization. And so there are natural features which replicate things in your own practice. So that's how they help your practice. And I think as human beings, we sort of know there's a kind of natural instinctiveness when we're in a place that just everything is sort of just arranged properly. If you go to a national park here in the United States, there's certain places, if you go to Yellowstone, if you go to, one of the big national parks, Rocky Mountain National Park is just up the road from me. And you go, this is why there's a reason why they protected this particular place, because there's a kind of arrangement that somehow just sort of uplifts you and wakes you up in a particular way. And then once you start to cultivate that, it enhances the kind of energetic field. There's one text that I translated, which is a text describing a particular place where I'm very fortunate to do some research, in a place called Mechuka, which is in Arunachal Pradesh, and that's in northeast India. And it's on the border. It's borders southern Tibet. And there's a place called Pimlico, which is a very famous hidden land in Tibetan and Himalayan traditions. And the text itself talks about particular features of the landscape that correlate with this tantric idea, which is called Trinli Namshi, which is like the 4 enlightened activities. And this is a part of tantric practice, which is these activities which are pacification, magnetizing, enriching, and subjugating. And these are a kind of quartet of activities that work together and form part of that they show up in a lot of, I'm trying to be careful because I'm not trying to kind of give like tantric instruction here, but these kinds of activities show up a lot, let's say, in tantric practice. And so it's sort of like there's different ways of relating with things. And the land itself in this one text that I'm looking at is described. So this text that I translated has this figure, Padmasambhava, who's this great sort of Tibetan Buddha. And he's incredibly important in Tibetan religious history and Tibetan history in general. And he's talking to his partner, Yeshe Sogyo, who's asking him. And he says that the river, there's a part in the text I think is so beautiful, because he says the river is like the magnetizing activity, and the sound of the river sounds like the ringing of a bell. And it's like the melodious sound of a tantric bell, which is itself the sound of emptiness. And so it has all these descriptions. And actually, you can look at a lot of what you might call nature writing of Tibetan yogis. There's another amazing yogi in the Tibetan tradition called Longchenpa, who lived in the 14th century. And there's a beautiful poem which he's called the Spontaneous Song of the Wild Woods. And it's this description of the trees and of the insects and the birds. And there's no separation really between that experience of yourself and the phenomenal world. So I think that, I think your American views of nature are often fraught with this dichotomy of duality, but that's not so for Buddhist Tantra. In Buddhist Tantra, it affirms the embodied world as a unified field of liberation. So there isn't this disconnection from or disengagement with nature or a separation, but a kind of cognizant attunement to the phenomenal world. So in this worldview, and many other cultures, this isn't just in the Himalayan worldview, human, animal, vegetable, mineral, spirit realms ultimately share the same nature. So it's recognizing it. It's like there's a way of bringing that in where everything is very vivid and present and resonant.
Can you share about how connecting with the land as deity can aid in one accomplishing those 4 enlightened activities?
If I try to explain it briefly, in the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition, deity practice involves developing a relationship with expressive energy that is none other than your own nature, free of delusion and duality. And there's ways of connecting with that called deity practice, where there's a generation phase where you're kind of generating the wisdom of the deity, and you're sort of inviting that wisdom, and then inviting that into one's own heart, let's say heart center, and then becoming that with sort of a kind of supreme confidence. But it's not arrogance, it's not pride. And this visualization practice, it isn't simply imagination. It's actually a generation of that expressive energy, which is sort of free from self-reification. It's released from ego attachment. And then there's a completion stage, which is a dissolution piece. And you have these particular places in these landscapes. For example, Pamukko is understood as the body of Vajravarahi, who's this deity in the Tibetan tradition. And she's this kind of amazing scarlet goddess who cuts through ignorance. And there are places that are envisioned as parts of her body and chakras of her body, and the river, the Brahmaputra, or in Tibetan it's the Sangpo, but it becomes the Brahmaputra as it comes down into India, is visualized as her central channel. And it's this complete sort of embodied unified field that happens where there isn't the separation. But it's also not something you can hold on to either. That's a really important part of it as well. And you'll find, again, in the tradition, you find these texts where yogis have gone to these places to try and to find various parts of the landscape that correlate to the chakras, particular chakras of the body of this goddess, to do particular practices there to work on that, opening that chakra or bringing the energy into the central channel. There's all sorts of different subtle body practices as an incredibly complex subject. But those places they have a kind of juice. They're juicy places to do that kind of practice. And they're not easy places to get to often. So you'll find these texts where you have these Tibetan yogis and they're going to try and find the secret chakra of Vajravarahi. And, you know, they get bitten by flies and they're attacked by wild boars. And there's just, it's like a really difficult journey to find these places and do practice. And they're purifying their karma, because in this tradition, you can liberate within one lifetime. But there's a lot of stuff you got to get through to do something like that. And so I love the idea that these places connect you with that expressive energy of the deity. That's the piece that I find really advanced. It's a very evolved human idea, actually.
Can you say more about that?
I think it relates back to what I was saying earlier about how there's a very limited view that is maintaining a separation, a kind of duality that has dominated thinking for quite a few centuries now. I'm very interested in these ideas or this understanding of there's something that's in between that, or something that is, I'm trying to think of what the right word is, but it feels like those yogis who were going there were understanding things that a lot of our minds can't conceive of, but they were opening out into a view that is incredibly expansive, and I just think is very highly evolved. And I think you can look at a lot of indigenous cultures have that higher evolved view of reality. And I'm really interested in that.
I love that. I mean, it's interesting hearing you share that, because it's so risky, right? It's so risky to go out of the norm. And yet
Yes.
it's like having these liberated, reverential views are, I think, what we deeply want. And yet to really have trust in the expression of the deity, and like to go on this enormous pilgrimage that you might die, who knows, you might get poisoned. I mean, it's so incredible that that trust in this, what you're speaking of, this larger possibility that we have maybe innately someplace within some of us.
Yeah, it's trust and confidence. And actually, the Tibetan word depa is often translated as faith, but it also means trust and confidence. And that kind of devotion, I think we have a different idea in the English language of the word faith. When you understand the Tibetan word, it's this kind of enlightened confidence. It's this trust. It's not heavy and it's not dogmatic. It's got a lot of humor. It's got a lot of equanimity. We tend to think of faith in a way where there's a sort of oppressive quality sometimes with this idea of faith and devotion in, let's say, Euro-American culture, which isn't present in that word. It's this beautiful confidence without egotistic pride. And that's something to cultivate. And that's a very much a part of the Buddhist Tantric path, is to develop the confidence of the deity. That's the whole point. That's a whole big part of the generation. phase is to have the is to really, I don't want to say embody some, but maybe it is. It's yeah, I guess it's like the confidence of the deity is present. Yeah. So I like that you use that word trust, because that's a big part of it.
Yeah. So I thank you so much. And I yeah, it sounds just also like the meditations, the pilgrimage meditations have this very engaged aspect. Like, you know, usually when we think of practice, even from a tantric perspective, sometimes we see these people just sitting on a mountain looking out, right, in a more Dzogchen view or something like that. And there's something, it sounds like these pilgrimages to these hidden places involve every aspect of you. So there's nothing left out. It's all consuming in many ways.
Yes.
Very different than
Yeah.
the modern life that we have now, which is so mental.
Yeah, and I think that's also a mistake that we make in our culture when we think about, you know, practice, and we think it's the sitting on the mountaintop being quiet and sitting still, when, yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, you read these pilgrimages, and like, it's all part of it, you know, it's all part of it. Getting food poisoning is part of it, but, you know, falling into an enormous patch of giant stinging nettles is part of it. You know, tripping over a log and falling on your face in a massive puddle is all part of it. You know, it's everything about it. It's the inner and outer pilgrimage that's working together at the same time. It's an outward journey, but it's also an inward one as well.
So I would love to talk about the significance of Mechuka, a place you have studied and you mentioned a little bit earlier, and
Mm-hmm.
why there? Like, why is that the place you've spent time? And then also moving into the rituals offered, like what you've actually learned about how they're creating more balance between this place and the inhabitants, seen and unseen.
Yeah, so Mechuka is a place. It's considered a smaller, less known Baal or hidden land. And I started working in Arunachal Pradesh when I was doing my doctoral work. I wasn't working on sacred landscape then. I was working on looking at a very well-known and beloved Lama, modern day Lama, who passed away in the early 2000s, called Kunsan Dejin Lingpa. And he was a terton, which is a treasure revealer. And he revealed a lot of practices that, and did a lot of healing practices, and came to the United States and came to the United Kingdom to offer those. And I got really interested in what he was doing. He was revealing teachings and adapting them really for a modern era. And I translated his biography, and he had a center that was based in Arunachal Pradesh. And I went there several times for my doctoral fieldwork. And during the course of that time, I obviously made a lot of friends. I met a lot of people there. I made a lot of friends. And then ultimately I met my husband, who is from Mechuka. He was born in Mechuka. And it's opening up now, but even back then it was a very remote place. It was very difficult to get to. When I first started going to Arunachal Pradesh, as a foreigner, I could only get a permit for 10 days. And when you consider that it often takes 2 or 3 days to get to anywhere, it was really difficult to kind of visit some places and really do any kind of significant research or talk to people or meet people or learn anything, because you would never really have enough time. And then it started to open up into being able, you could go for a month. And then I met my husband, and obviously then I started visiting his home village of Mechuka. And it's a very fascinating place. And I guess I suppose I could be criticized for being too connected. This is something that happens in academia a lot. It's like, well, you're too involved, you're too connected to that place, you can't possibly be objective. And that's something that I push up against a lot, actually, because I don't think anyone can be truly objective. There's always some kind of subjectivity. But I was just really interested in the history of the place, and talking with friends and family members and people in the wider community. It felt really important to here's me who, like, I've learned Tibetan, I have access to all these historical texts. Why not actually investigate this more, but make sure that I'm doing it in a way that, one, the community actually wants and is interested in, and is of benefit to them. And that's really important in my work, because I don't want to be one of those sort of European or American or Westerner anthropologists or scholars who come in and become the expert, and this is my place. This is not my place. I'm a guest. I'm incredibly honored to have been invited into this community, and I want to give something back. And so, in having conversations with some of the members of that community, I became interested in the history of the place, but not just in a sort of maybe Western historical sense, but in really interested in their sense of what their history is, and their stories and songs and traditions. And it's now it's opening up. It's still kind of difficult to get there. It's opening up, but there's a lot of development happening, and there's rubbish showing up. There's trash. There's things there's buildings happening, and then construction waste being dumped in the river, which is where people wash their clothes. The rivers are drying up. The local springs are drying up. There's been places where there's been a lot of illness, and they rely on the natural springs for their drinking water. And I said, in some of the conversations, I said, what do you want me to talk about? If I was doing some work on this, and if I did research here, what would you be interested in doing? And they're concerned about their land. They're concerned about this place. It's a precious place, and it needs to be protected, and especially because it has this. The outer understanding is that it's a very beautiful place, and it's a very fertile place, so things grow there well, and and there's fresh water. But it's also, in terms of practice, in terms of a spiritual understanding, it's a sacred place, and so that also needs to be protected. And there's no separation between those things. They're all together. And so I feel very honored and humbled to be able to do work there, and to understand the stories and the ways in which they understand their own land. And this sort of relates to one article that I shared with you, which isn't published yet, which was, I realized that I had to actually work on my own relationship with the land, with the non-humans beings or spirits of landscape, that I actually had to do some recovery work of my own before I was able to actually engage with some of the rituals and what's happening in Mechuka. So this is something that I talked about recently in a talk I gave, which was, I grew up in a very rural part of the United Kingdom. I grew up on an old farm, and I grew up with these stories embedded in my reality. So my neighbors believed in fairies, and there were places in the landscape, there there were parts of the field where there were certain places that were, you never cut those trees down because those were the fairy trees. And it was just a part of the whole the worldview. And as I got older and, and I started to sort of leave some of that behind, and then I become a scholar, and I suddenly thought, this is so weird, because here I am looking at, nagas, right? These serpentine beings that are associated with the water and the underworld in the Tibetan tradition. And I'm really interested in them because they protect the water and they protect the environment. And they're very touchy. And so there are all these rituals in Mechuka and other places in the Himalayas where you don't mess with them, and you apologize when you've done something wrong. If you've cut down a tree, or you've moved rocks, or you've done any kind of that activity, there's a wisdom that's encoded into those relationships. And I realized that, so I go to conferences and I do all this research, and it's okay for me to talk about those relationships and those people over there, but I can never mention fairies or leprechauns or elves or any of that stuff, because people will be like, oh yeah, there's that, she's all into fairies, and don't take her seriously. And I thought, that's not okay with me, actually. I want to understand. It's not that I'm trying to prove the existence of these beings, but I'm really interested in those relationships. And I realized that if I wasn't showing up with my own relationships in the right way, that I was coming to a place like Mechuka empty-handed. It's like I was coming to a party with nothing to offer. It's like you don't show up to a party, you show up with a bottle of wine and some flowers. So it felt like there was an impoverishment that I needed to work on as well, in order to be able to show up and understand properly that there was some right relationships. And so I'm doing this sort of dual work where I'm working on my own internal view while I'm there, which is exactly what that land's supposed to do. Right? I think I may have gone off a little bit more on your question than maybe you were asking.
Yeah, it's totally fine. No, it's totally connected. I mean, I'm very curious what wisdom so far you've gleaned from your own, magical inhabitants of the British Isles. I mean, just from hearing, where is that right now in terms of your self-study and process?
I think it's part of it is to go back and re-examine and also, in a way, recover and reclaim those relationships. And so, I started to look into this, and I found that there's a site in Ireland that is it's a place of scientific and natural biodiversity that's a protected landscape, and part of the protected species in the list of protected species of that landscape are leprechauns, and that it's actually included in the directive that they are protected species along with the plants and the animals. And that this really affected me. I went to a place it's in Scotland, in Dumfriesshire, and there's a Summiling, which is a Buddhist center. It's one of the first Tibetan Buddhist centers that was ever established in Europe. And they have, when you go up to the main gates of that Dharma center in Scotland, I think it's off to the left, I can't remember, but on one side by the gate there's this little hill, and there's prayer flags, and there's a little fence around it, and there's a gate, and it's a fairy hill, and they've protected it, and they've built stupas. They've built these rock formations that mark a particular spot on various parts of the river, and they do rituals for the nagas, for the aquatic beings. They even go and do a particular ritual at Loch Ness for the Loch Ness monster, because the Loch Ness monster is a Naga, is one of these spirits. And I thought, so here are Tibetans coming, and they're recognizing the local Sadak. They're called Sadak, the sort of territorial lords of the earth. They're recognizing these beings and developing a right relationship with these beings in my place where I'm from. And I kind of want that back. I felt like there was this sort of, it was present in my childhood, and it feels something that has, been a little bit lost or impoverished. And I really feel that I talk about this in my paper, which is, this is a decolonizing process for someone like me. This is a process of actually undoing some of that colonization, because even if you're, I'm British, so I'm, descended from colonizers, but I've been colonized too. And like, what does that work look like for me? It's different for different people, but for me, it's actually being able to go back and realize that whole process of colonization has also harmed me. And how do I show up in a better way as a scholar, as a practitioner? All of those things are kind of intertwined for me. And so that work is really important. So I actually want to go and do some retreats and do some research also in Ireland and in Scotland and in some of those places, not because I want to become a scholar of those things, but because I feel that it will make me a better researcher in the field that I'm in. And I would finish that by saying that I feel like that is a blessing that I have received from these places, from going and being in these places, because it's allowed me to see that I need to develop that kind of right relationship. But there's a whole lot of stuff to unwind.
The landscape is very powerful in Scotland. I know Scotland and Wales a lot more than I have never been to Ireland. But I imagine there's a similar potency. I'm curious your experience in terms of exploring those hidden lands.
Yes. I mean, there's places that you go and you just know, I mean, that, if you ever go to some of the places, so like up in the Highlands or some of the islands of Scotland where you have all these stone circles, they knew, they knew. And they they created places to sort of focus and do practice. And I'm just really fascinated by that as a scholar in religious studies. I'm really fascinated by the relationships that you have with the human beings have with the land, and all the different relationships. But it also has, I think this is important to say, it has pragmatic outcomes, because if you understand that when you have that kind of relationship and it's been cultivated over 1,000 years, it's sustained us as human beings. And if you look at cultures that have these kinds of relationships, those relationships have a lot of very, very practical, applicable kind of action in them, which is like, don't pollute your drinking water, don't cut down all the trees, don't decimate the land so you can't grow anything anymore, don't take more than you need, have a right relationship with the land. And there's a kind of deep level. It's like, I talk about these beings or spirits of the land, whatever you want to call them, as the agents of deep time. And so it's more about they are reflecting back an imperative, an ecological imperative. So that's another part of my work, because you realize that the communities that still maintain these kinds of relationships, though it keeps their water clean, their crops, everything is balanced. And so it actually really does have a lot of real world application as well. When I was in Bhutan quite a year or so ago, and I had to leave because of the pandemic. But I was talking to I was at the College of Natural Resources in Punakha in Bhutan, and I was visiting faculty, and I was talking to some of the faculty there who are looking at water conservation of water resources in Bhutan. And I was asking them about, when you go to these places, do people are still doing these Naga rituals to protect the water? And they said, well, yeah, but it has a lot of practical application, because there's times when people don't go there, and it allows the land to recover, and it allows the water to stay clean. And those kinds of relationships as scientists, most of my colleagues that I was talking to there were scientists. They're like, yes, but the relationships that these communities have is very good, because it keeps the land clean, and it allows the land to recover, and it's part of sustainability practice. And so that's also something that I think that I want to emphasize, is that it isn't just because I'm interested in spirits and energy and all of that stuff. I really feel like these relationships are important to keep our planet going. I think if we don't actually understand this, we're going to ruin our planet. And this is an imperative. And a lot of indigenous cultures, people are actually, those of us who have kind of oppressed those cultures and have disregarded their wisdom, are starting to realize they actually knew what they were talking about. They lived with their land and in balance with their land for centuries. And look what we've done in the past 300 years to our planet. So I think that there's actually a really important practical application that's embodied and encoded within these relationships that is also important. And I think that this actually can be part of all sorts of different kinds of conservation efforts.
I so appreciate that. And I liked in that unpublished paper you sent, where you talked about how the Memba people of Mechuka are the protectors of that land. And so they actually feel some sense of responsibility, like they actually need to, relate to anything that is out of balance. And when I think of Himalayan culture and all of these rituals, I know at least in the West, we have very few rituals. In a deep kind of, I find like Himalayan culture does encapsulate visualizations, all these mythological creatures. And is there something like that in the West?
There's a lot I could say about this. Having grown up in Europe and grown up where I did, I grew up in a very small rural place, and a lot of the folk that I grew up around were from that place for generations and generations. And so I grew up with the local well where there was a natural spring. In the springtime in May, there's a well dressing ceremony, and everybody comes and dresses the well and puts flowers. And so I grew up actually with a lot of that kind of ritual embedded into my reality. And it's less so than some cultures. But when I moved to the States, I realized that a lot of Americans, who are particularly those who are of European descent, so I say Euro-Americans, I think that there's a lot of extra kind of cultivation that has to happen, because there's a kind of disconnection with their own land and their own place. And so when I go back to the British Isles, when I walk through that landscape, particularly in certain areas of that country where I know my family come from, I remember the stories that my grandmother told me, all the names of the flowers, and there were songs that went with all the flowers. And I know why. I know why there's yew trees planted in cemeteries. I know why there's rowan trees over the. I know I'm reading the landscape and understanding things that maybe somebody might not. If you were like, I had an American friend who was with me who commented on how when I was pointing things out, it just sort of they weren't experiencing the landscape in the same way. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about an impoverishment, because when you have that disconnect and there's this impoverishment where you don't have that connection with your ancestors, with your own ancestral rituals, with your own landscapes, then I think all human beings long for those relationships. And when you have that kind of impoverishment, you just try and hold on to or grab onto what someone else has. And that's one of the painful things about the appropriation of indigenous traditions and cultures, that I think that particularly Euro-Americans, but Europeans in general, actually have to really kind of find their own places and their own culture and their own base and foundation. So then it's what I'm talking about showing up empty-handed. Mm-hmm. So we're human beings. We have those kinds of longings for those. I think we do. As spiritual beings, we have those longings for the ritualization of things. And in a lot of cultures, life itself is a ceremony. Life itself is has that kind of quality, whether you're, feeding the animals or harvesting your crops or whatever it is that you're doing. And so that is, I'm really fascinated by that. And I also feel that it's an impoverished view if I'm just studying it from a very kind of, off to the side, right? And I know that, as a scholar, I have to strike this balance of I'm studying this, I'm trying to understand it, I want to write about it. I don't want to get I don't want to fall too deeply in where I'm losing a kind of, I'm getting completely subjective, but at the same time, I don't want to be standing on the edges either. So that's something that I'm always trying to explore, is to participate at the same time. So I'm interested in sort of like a participatory kind of scholarship, which not everyone's on board with that. That's okay. I don't, it's fine. But I think that a lot of my colleagues, whether they want to admit it or not, have gone out to study the cultures and the rituals of other peoples because they've nothing of their own. And I think that has to change. I think if we actually really want, it's not that I shouldn't be allowed to study the cultures of others, but I should be showing up with a good base and foundation of my own. And I think that this is something that really is the work of the European Americans and the Europeans, is to actually work on our own impoverishment, because it's quite painful to feel. I see this in my students, when I'm teaching and when we talk about connections, and there's this sort of void, there's this blank space that I think is why a lot of, I'd say, so why Americans try and grab onto the culture and rituals of indigenous peoples. And there's a different thing when you're invited than when you kind of show up and just try and take. And so when you're invited and you're bringing your own culture with you in a humble way, that there's something about that that I think a lot of scholars and anthropologists should be doing. And I see this, I do see this happening. You know, there's a lot of movement in the realm of academia about decolonizing. And it tends to come from, you know, people who have been colonized, working to break some of that and move away from some of that. But when I read that, I think, well, how does that apply to me? And to the way it applies to me is I actually have to work with how that's caused me to be cut off and impoverished.
What are some examples that you've had, that you've seen, of places, like obviously in Mechuka, they're doing certain rituals with Nagas. Just any examples of where using this reciprocity towards land and relating, you know, actually having a relationship with landscapes and its intangible inhabitants is, what are people doing specifically to remediate imbalance?
There's some really interesting work going on in the Indian area called Sikkim, which is also up in the north. It's sort of on, Bhutan is an incredibly interesting place. Bhutan has, I mean, you know, Bhutan is I feel so lucky to have been able to visit Bhutan. I'm not trying to make it into some, you know, oh, it's paradise and it's perfect. It's not. Human beings are flawed, and there's it's not like it's this. I don't want to idealize it, but at the same time, there's so much just common sense and wisdom and this kind of relationality with the land in a place like Bhutan, where things are allowed to thrive naturally in their own places, and nothing is over harvested. Nothing is, you know, I have something like they have 85% of forest cover, and they're a carbon neutral country. And so because they haven't deforested their land, they're actually reducing the carbon levels from all around the area in that region, because of all the trees. It's almost like the country itself is doing tonglen for the world, right? And that's the thing of the, you know, you sort of take in the poison and breathe out positivity. So, you know, in the time that I was there, I saw, you know, there's places where there are mountains that you can't climb because the gods live up there, and so you don't go up there. Human beings don't go up there. There's laws about how many fish you can take and how many trees you can cut down, and there's all these kinds of things. But they have this really, they've tied it in with their like, you know, it's this, you know, Bhutan has this gross national happiness indexed, and the land itself, the quality of the land and the sustainability of the land is tied in together with human flourishing, right? And so their environmental policies really are something that the rest of the world should be listening to. And places like Sikkim also are doing some similar things. And Sikkim itself is also considered to be a hidden land. And there's conservation efforts based there where it's very much tied in there with the conservation efforts. Like, this is a sacred land. It has all these qualities. This is why it's important to preserve it. And so it's actually built into conservation policies in certain places. And there's other parts of Northeast India that are also doing the same thing. So there's actually a lot going on. And I would say that there are places in various pockets around the world, but I'm talking specifically now about what I've seen in the Himalayas, that is using very, very old wisdom that people go, oh, that's all kind of, you know, fairies and spirits. And I don't dismiss that, because they've managed to keep their places sustainable and thriving because of those relationships. And so there's some things we can learn from that.
Is there anything that you feel you really want to share, or any topic specifically we haven't touched on that's feels burning for you?
I wanted to, I don't know if this fits at the end here, but it's about this understanding of, this is less about the conservation and sustainability pieces that I was talking about, but this idea of this, of sacred places and landscapes that are sacralized, if you like, by the practice of yogis in the past and the present, and places that themselves have these sort of naturally, spontaneously resonant places. And I wanted to actually read you an excerpt from there's a book on sacred landscape that's been translated by a really wonderful scholar called Ngawang Zangpo, and it's on sacred places and pilgrimage by a 19th century scholar and yogi and wizard and great sort of treasure revealer called Jamgon Kongtrul, and this is the 19th century. And there's this part where he talks about visiting sacred places, and I'd like to read it if you don't mind. So this was translated by Ngawang Zangpo, and this is from a 19th century great Tibetan scholar and practitioner called Jamgon Kongtrul. And so I'll just read it to you. He who always visits sacred places without faith or respect, with the idea that they only contain ordinary earth and stone, is a beast in the body of a man. Think of this, and please exert yourself to cultivate as much merit as you can. Kyamaho. To those of aberrant minds, this place is just earth, stone, water, and trees. To mistaken intellects, it appears as solid, inanimate objects. To practitioners, appearances have no intrinsic nature. To those of pure vision, it is a celestial palace full of deities. To those with realization, it is the radiant luminosity of innate awareness. That's from a book called Sacred Ground, Jamgon Kongtrul on Pilgrimage and Sacred Geography, translated by Ngawang Zangpo. And to me, that just encapsulates this whole idea of like how there are different levels of seeing the land. That passage, when I read that the very first time, that's actually really what sparked a lot of my subsequent work on sacred landscape, because it was like, you're not just seeing inert stone and rocks. There's this whole other level of understanding and seeing reality. And so I wanted to share that, because it's like that's somehow that kind of kickstarted everything that I've been talking about today.
So powerful. Thank you so much, Amelia. To feel both the scholarly aspect and the yogic aspect, the importance of these relationships with landscape, and how much our perception dictates how we are in the world, you know, both as practitioners and as protectors, stewards. It's really inspiring, your work, and I'm excited to see what continues to unfold.
I mean, thank you for inviting me. It's like I love talking about this, and I want to just encourage more scholar practitioners to come out into the light, because another thing that really inspired me or sort of compelled me to do the kind of work that I'm doing is that I was continually frustrated by reading scholarship on sacred landscape that was always couched in this language of suppression and subjugation, and that there's so many different levels that's happening here when you study this tradition and you read these texts. And you actually have to have that view if you're really going to talk about it, and if you really want to impart some sense of what these what this tradition is saying. You actually have to have that, a little bit of that understanding for a fuller view of what this is all about. So I hope that it will encourage other scholar practitioners to, sally forth and put their work out there. I'm encouraged that there's more of us showing up.
May it be so.
And I hope you're going to be one of us. You're going to join our gang.
Thanks, Amelia. Your kindness always.